By the late 19-teens, a number of foreign models had fallen away. The promise of constitutionalism had been undone by Yuan Shikai, who, as Fairbank once said, murdered Chinese democracy in the crib. And his alternatives for a constitutional emperorship were undone by everyone else. The Western democracies were in ill repute in China. They had won the First World War in Europe and indeed invited China in as an ally, but they held on to their imperialist privileges in China. For some Chinese, the slaughter of the First World War was more than enough to discredit the West as a model for inspiration. So perhaps it wasn't surprising that the next foreign model to come to China would be somewhat anti-Western, although Western nonetheless. And that's communism, the second foreign model tried out in the Republican period. Not the Maoist communism that would ultimately take control of the Chinese mainland in 1949, or at least not exactly. Rather, the first stage of communism in China is the communism of the Communist International, of which the new Chinese Communist Party, founded by the Communist International in 1921, was a member. Let's start with some basic facts. The Chinese Communist Party was a creation of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, or more accurately, of the Communist International, or Comintern, the third international founded by Lenin as the international arm, as one will, of communist parties the world over, but led by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. This is not to say that the Soviet Union brought the Chinese Communist Party to power. It did not. But without its founding influence, Chinese communism as we understand it today would not exist. Let me put it in Chinese. 没有苏联就没有中国共产党，没有苏联就没有新中国。 There was considerable mutual appeal between the new Soviet Union, founded as a revolutionary state in 1917, and a number of Chinese intellectuals who had founded the Chinese Communist Party. For young Chinese, it was in part their belief that, unlike constitutional monarchy or parliamentary democracy, here was a Western model that was itself anti-Western, or at least anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist. It repudiated, and indeed it was trying to overthrow, Western democracies and monarchies. Second, it claimed that it was in the age of science. It was part of a scientific interpretation of historical forces. It could predict how societies were going to evolve. And it explained how other Western models that Chinese had sought to emulate were nothing but the political superstructure of an exploitive economic system, capitalism, which needed to expand worldwide, and therefore gave rise, Lenin said, to imperialism. In some sense, it explained how China had come to be humiliated at the hands of the West. Third, it offered China an important role in the new socialist world as one of the chief battlegrounds in the worldwide struggle for communism and against imperialism. Fourth, and this is a great contribution of Lenin, it offered Chinese intellectuals a new kind of organization, the centralized revolutionary party where a few leaders could make decisions which their followers were sworn to carry out no matter what, a highly disciplined approach to revolution, democratic centralism. Fifth, and if this wasn't enough, communism seemed to promise rapid development for China. It offered the newest, best ism of the day. Why settle for anything less? It promised also a non-capitalist path to development, one that might skip over or at least truncate the capitalist phase of development that Marx had talked about and jump straight into socialism. Why go through the whole process when one could see the light at the end of the tunnel already? And though they differed on many things, the two leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, the two co-founders of it, Chen Dushou and Li Dajiao, agreed on that. And so for the first 2 years of their young party's existence, they believed that their main task was to organize the newest of Chinese social classes, the urban proletariat, to seize power and to prepare the way for Chinese socialism. It was this hope that would be quite rudely shattered by their tutors in communism, the representatives of the Communist International, or the Comintern, led by the Soviet Union. The Communist Party of China had been founded by the Comintern. and the Comintern reserved for itself the right to make policy for the various parties that adhered to it. That's what socialist discipline was all about. And if the Chinese Communist Party wanted international help, which it desperately did, it would have to submit to international communist discipline. This is the Leninist notion again of democratic centralism, of obedience, in this case to the world's first socialist state. The Comintern was, as it called itself, the general staff of the world revolution. And the Comintern had a different diagnosis for China's revolution. It could not, it said, be a communist one, at least right away. It had first to be a capitalist one, led by nationalist, anti-foreign forces. Only then, it said, would socialism have a chance. Never mind that China's bourgeoisie was even smaller than its tiny proletariat and even less politicized than Russia's had been. Never mind all that. It was proper theory at the time. The Comintern adhered to it, and Comintern member parties had to adhere to it. And so, as they surveyed the Chinese scene, the Comintern saw the Chinese Communist Party as simply too small and too weak. They wanted it to ally with other anti-imperialist forces in order to break the perceived encirclement of the Soviet Union. Well, however theoretically sound in Marxist terms, or however well geared to Soviet national interests, the idea of promoting a so-called bourgeois democratic phase to the Chinese Revolution was very alien to the few young idealistic members of the new Chinese Communist Party. They wanted to go out and make revolution, to organize what little there was of the Chinese proletariat. So they had to be dragged kicking and screaming by communist discipline into what would later be known as the First United Front, with the supposedly bourgeois democratic forces of the Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party, led now again by Sun Yat-sen. In 1924, that alliance took place between the nationalists and the communists. And as the official Chinese Communist Party history put it, quote, "The resolution was adopted unanimously, although many individual comrades opposed it." This was the plan. Based on a Western theory, social classes and stages of revolution, and on the state interests of the Soviet Union. How did it work? Not badly, at first. A large number of young, idealistic Soviets and other internationals came to China to help. They advised Sun Yat-sen and his nationalist party. They armed it. They trained his army. 30,000 troops by 1925, 150,000 by 1926. They made his the only army in China with an ideology. They made it powerful enough that beginning in 1926, it could march from South China from its base in Guangzhou to conquer most of its enemies in the south, and then march north to unify the country under a new government. So from a military point of view, the new alliance was an enormous success. From a political point of view, at least from the Chinese Communist Party, not so successful. Stalin and others in Moscow had declared that Sun Yat-sen, who would die in 1925, and his young protege from Zhejiang, Chiang Kai-shek, who took control of the movement after Sun's death, that these were the embodiment of the Chinese bourgeoisie, and they could be expected to act as such, to play their historical role in completing the bourgeois revolution that should come before the socialist revolution. But they forgot to tell Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek what history had dictated that they do. Maybe the problem was language. The Russians didn't speak Chinese, and for the most part, the Chinese didn't speak Russian. They communicated almost exclusively in English. It's a bizarre but true fact that in the mid-1920s, the Central Executive Committee of the Nationalist Party held its meetings and wrote its minutes in English. Another problem was that Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek did not conceive of themselves as particularly bourgeois or capitalistic, and indeed, there are many anti-capitalist strains in their thought. In social terms, it was difficult to think of them as part of a coherent class. Their supporters were merchants, landholders, professionals, and they were united above all by the personality and drive of Sun Yat-sen. They were less a political party than a revolutionary brotherhood. Now, one solution to this potential theoretical problem was to purge the party of members who didn't fit socialist theory. This was tried after Sun Yat-sen's death in a purge of 1926, but to no lasting effect. And the chief Comintern advisor, Borodin, was heard to say, "The Nationalist Party, like all bourgeois parties, is like a toilet. That is to say, no matter how often you flush it or purge it, it still stinks." It was clear by 1926 that the Chinese Communist Party, which the Comintern had come to China to help, to found and to help, was now riding a tiger. The supposedly bourgeois Nationalist Party had benefited even more from Russian assistance, and together in their united front, the armies of Chiang Kai-shek marched north in 1926 with his personal power growing day by day. And it seemed clear that Chiang Kai-shek knew of the plans of the Soviets and the Chinese Communist Party to dump him, and he planned to dump the Communists first when he had a chance. What were the Communist Party and their Soviet allies to do? Well, they could have admitted that the Western theory was wrong. Maybe not all societies go through the same stages. Maybe Chiang Kai-shek was not the embodiment of the bourgeoisie. Maybe he was instead, as Russian advisors were writing home, something quite unclassifiable. Borodin would come to question the belief that Chiang was the so-called embodiment of the bourgeoisie, and he wrote this, quote, "We find Chiang Kai-shek to be a peculiar man with peculiar characteristics, foremost of which is his craving for glory and his desire to be the hero of China." This was an accurate but very un-Marxist interpretation, and it would be ignored in Moscow. Or maybe it wasn't the fault of the theory but those applying it, the fault of Stalin, the Soviet Union. This was a view urged by his opponents in and outside of Russia, particularly Trotsky. But no, of course. Marxism was scientific, and Stalin, even at this early age of his career, was infallible. So the Communist Party of China stayed in its united front with the Nationalist Party to the end. This is an alliance truly, as the Chinese phrase has it, of 同床异梦, sleeping in the same bed but dreaming very different dreams. An alliance of marital infidelity. And the greater its success, the more certain was its end by one party seeking to devour the other. But it was Chiang Kai-shek, not as the embodiment of the bourgeoisie, but as the military man craving to be the strong man of China, who would squeeze that lemon first, purge the Chinese Communist Party as soon as he had consolidated his power at the Yangtze River. And when Chiang Kai-shek was ordering that all the communists be shot, he also expelled the Russian advisors who trekked over the Gobi Desert to go home. And he recruited advisors from another Western nation, in this case, Germany.